It was the evening of October 1st, 1969, when I first smuggled several hundred pages of top-secret documents out of my safe at the Rand Corporation. The study contained 47 volumes, 7,000 pages. My plan was to Xerox the study and reveal the secret history of the Vietnam War to the American people.
The FBI was trying to find out who gave the New York Times a copy of the Pentagon's secret study.
Pow, like a thunderclap, you get the New York Times publishing the Pentagon papers, and the country is panicking.
This is an attack on the whole integrity of government. If whole file cabinets can be stolen and then made available to the press, you can't have orderly government anymore.
A name has now come out as the possible source of the Times Pentagon documents. It is that of Daniel Ellsberg, the top policy analyst for the Defense and State Departments.
I think it is time in this country to quit making national heroes out of those who steal secrets and publish them in the newspaper.
In the first year of marriage, we're talking about him going to prison for the rest of his life.
Are girls forgiven if you concerned about the possibility of going to prison for this?
We have a quick back. Wouldn't you go to prison to tell this war?
We felt so strongly that we were dealing with a national security crisis. Henry Kissinger said that Dr. Daniel Ellsberg was the most dangerous man in America, and he had to be stopped.
On the morning of August 4th, 1964, I began my first full-time employment in the Pentagon, working under Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. My very first day on the job, all hell broke loose. A courier came running in with a flash cable saying that American warships were under attack in the Tonkin Gulf off the coast of North Vietnam. And I was getting these because my boss was already down the hall with McNamara picking targets to retaliate against North Vietnam. Minute after minute, more cables came in. 3 torpedoes have been fired. 7, we are taking evasive action. At about 1:30 our time, comes a new cable from the commodore of the 2 ships. Hold everything, in effect. All previous reports of torpedoes are in question.
Renewed. The military forces of the United States to take action.
Within days, it was clearer and clearer that there had been no attack.
I shall immediately request the Congress to pass a resolution.
President Johnson was determined to prevent a communist victory in South Vietnam. He twisted the facts of the Tonkin Gulf incident to persuade Congress to give him unlimited authority to use military force. He then launched a war that would last another 11 years.
By a number of hostile vessels.
Senator Fulbright, you moved the Tonkin resolution through the Senate. Did you know anything about this?
I accepted the story given to us by the President and Mr. McNamara and Mr. Rusk, and I believe General Wheeler. I had no reason at that time and under those circumstances to doubt the validity, the truthfulness of this whole operation.
We still seek no wider war.
No wider war? As I found out day by day in the Pentagon, that was our highest priority. Preparing a wider war which we expected to take place immediately after the election.
It's a war that I think ought to be fought by the boys of Asia to help protect their own land. And for that reason, I haven't chosen to enlarge the war.
And that was a conscious lie. We all knew that inside the government, and not one of us told the press or the public or the electorate during that election. It was a well-kept secret by thousands and thousands of people, including me.
Much has been written about the war in Vietnam, but little has made us understand what it is really like. My guest today, David Halberstam.
I had a radio program that was syndicated across the country. I was down in Washington, D.C. at the time doing interviews of congressmen and people in the government. And a mutual friend had offered to host a party on my behalf. And he was inviting his friends. And he said, there's one friend I'll invite, but stay away from him. He's brilliant, but dangerous. Meaning that he was quite a ladies' man, having just recently gotten divorced. He rang the doorbell, and they were those sunken lights from the ceiling, and they hit his blue eyes, and I just went, ah, like this. He was so handsome.
I just thought of her at that time as above my dating class. I worked every Saturday, a full day, that's 12 hours, and every Sunday, half a day. I did think of calling her up when I had my first day off from the Pentagon, and said, I have tomorrow off, and would you like to go see the cherry blossoms?
And I said, no, I'm covering the peace rally for the radio program.
This is my first day off. I've been working on the war now for 70 hours a week. You can't really ask me to spend it at an anti-war rally. We marched around the White House. I was carrying her a heavy tape recorder, and I remember thinking, I hope this is not a still photograph in the Washington Post tomorrow where I am, because it's going to be a little hard to explain.
And I bumped into some friends who were liberal, radical friends. And the husband said, how can you be going out with somebody who's working on Vietnam in the Pentagon?
Early 1965, the Vietnam War was about to expand, and I was one of its planners. I had received orders from Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to gather examples of atrocities perpetrated by the Viet Cong. The Secretary hoped such intelligence would convince President Johnson to launch a systematic bombing campaign against North Vietnam. I had voiced my personal opposition to the tactic of bombing the North, but an order from McNamara for fast action was like an order from God. I had a whole staff in Vietnam collecting data for me. I told the colonel on the other end of the hotline that it all had to be in for the president by 7 the next morning. I needed details of the atrocities by the Viet Cong anywhere in Vietnam. Above all, I wanted gory details of any injuries to Americans. I told the colonel, I need blood.
In the early 60s, Dan Ellsberg was a leading, if not the leading, young war thinker.
The atomic bomb had changed so much, and the military knew that they needed fresh thinking. And they established RAND and deliberately located it on the west coast of the United States so that it would be beyond the reach of anybody in Washington who wanted to meddle in it. And essentially, people were encouraged to think new thoughts, to think big. Dan really impressed people. Smart, imaginative, good at technical reasoning, good at logic. He could collect ideas from anywhere. He could read short stories and get ideas.
My work at Harvard was on decision-making under uncertainty. At the Rand Corporation, I've been studying the highest stakes hypothetical gamble in human history, whether or not to launch nuclear missiles on the basis of ambiguous warning.
He was focused on the question, if you had to go to war, how to do it in the least dangerous way. Who would make the decisions? How would the decisions get communicated? And what were the options available to the president?
About 4 a.m., I got what I was looking for. The colonel told me we've just gotten info that 2 American advisors appeared to have been captured and killed. I asked for graphic details to make it concrete, dramatic. The colonel told me that their bodies showed signs of being dragged, perhaps by chains. I said, good, more like that. Wow, Jesus, this is it. Anything else? Anything like this anywhere else? This was the only incident of its kind they found. It may have been the only one in the Vietnam War up to that point involving Americans, but one was enough for my report. At 6:30 a.m., I wrapped it up. A little after 9 o'clock, McNamara came back from the White House and told my boss to thank me for my input. It was exactly what he needed. That's, in fact, the most shameful episode I can think of that I really did at a critical moment help McNamara persuade the president by information I gave him that he should start a systematic campaign of bombing, to which I was totally opposed.
Dan Ellsberg felt everything with great intensity, but nothing more so than this notion he had of his own culpability for everything he had done in the early years of the war. He had an important role in what became the most ridiculously disproportional bombing campaign in the history of the world. Dan was not some passive bureaucratic participant in Vietnam. He was a true believer.
I saw our involvement in the context of a worldwide conflict with communism, a Cold War perspective that I shared with most of my fellow officials.
Vietnam, Vietnam! Vietnam, Vietnam!
I accepted the basic premises within the government that being allied with America was good for you, good for the other people. And there was an idealistic aspect of it. In Vietnam, we were protecting supposedly democracy, or the possibility of democracy, against a Stalinist dictatorship. I didn't want to watch the war, which we were now committed, back in Washington. I wanted to be there. I'd learned in the Marine Corps that to know what's happening, you have to be up at the front line. At division headquarters, they showed me a chart of hundreds of patrols going out every night in their zone. I actually picked a patrol from the chart. And it was at that point that the officer at battalion level informed me there were no patrols there any more than in the rest of the country. The chart was entirely a hoax, an illusion, like all the optimistic statistics that had been coming up for years. There were no night patrols by our Vietnamese forces. Only the Viet Cong were out at night. They owned the country at night.
We were very much in love. I joined Dan in Vietnam, and on that trip, he asked me to marry him. We went to this party where there was this person who had been in North Vietnam and was describing the effects of our bombing. It was a just welling up of a kind of visceral disgust.
And we left the party. Patricia, who had some drink during it, said,
"How can you be part of this?" Because in some ways, he was more part of it than I think he realized.
And I was thinking, oh, I'm against the bombing. I'm trying to stop all the bombing in South Vietnam, trying to do the best I can to moderate the killing. And I'm not getting any credit for that. and she's holding me responsible for the whole war.
My accusation of Dan, and I think the passion with which it came out, that really caused him to close off, because he was saying, I don't want to be with somebody that is that critical of me and that doesn't see that I'm risking my life to try to stop the bombing and trying to bring democracy to the country. But he was still buying into the whole zeitgeist of that war. The men that were his colleagues, who tended to be people in the State Department, were actually loving the whole scene of the danger, the risk, the adventure, almost like being in a John Wayne movie or something like that.
I think a lot of people want to join the Marines to see if they're up to it. Never been able to throw a hard ball, couldn't play with guns. I wanted to be a soldier, so the Marines were the chance to do that. I think I was the only first lieutenant in the 2nd Marine Division to have a rifle company. And I loved being a company commander, having the responsibility for 211 men, being totally in charge of their welfare and their training. That was the happiest period of my life professionally, looking back on, still is.
I left and I could tell he was withdrawn. His heart withdrew into a safe that I didn't have the combination to.
So in my own mind, this isn't going to happen. How can I be married to somebody who doesn't give me the benefit of the doubt on this somehow? As far as I was concerned, the engagement was off.
I first met Ellsberg in the paddy fields of the northern Mekong Delta in mid-1966. He had a Smyser submachine gun in his hand. He was dressed in fatigues, and he was attempting to lead an American infantry company on an attack on a sniper position in a hamlet. Dan Ellsberg then was very hawkish and very eager. And
was he then a Marine?
No, he wasn't. He was a civilian.
A civilian, and so
he was a civilian,
keen.
but I asked him what the devil was he doing in the Mekong Delta with a Smyser machine pistol. He said he had gone there to look at how the war was going. He felt it wasn't going very well, and he wanted to see it go better.
I was walking point with 3 other men ahead of the main company so we could spot an ambush. We heard firing from behind us. Looking back, I saw 2 Viet Cong in ragged shorts firing AK-47s.
You'd get on that position, there'd be no one there, and then you'd be hit from another clump. And I believe that bands were working us, essentially, alternately leapfrogging each other.
They must have been lying in the water as we walked by, and now they were firing at the troops following us. We couldn't fire at them because we'd be firing at our own troops.
Now, in the course of a day like that, you get a very great respect for these people who are, in effect, running circles around an American battalion. I remember looking up at a sergeant as we lay after about the 15th of these incidents and saying, "Do you ever feel like the Redcoats?" And he said, "Yeah, I've been thinking that all day."
I was beginning to realize we couldn't beat this enemy in their own backyard. We were not going to win. These guys were not going to give up. On the way back, which was on McNamara's plane, I'd had the chance to give him more than 100 single-space pages of my memos. He sat there and he hadn't apparently brought a lot to read. And I had the great bureaucratic pleasure of watching my superior actually read my papers and not just toss them aside. So he knew what I was thinking very much about the stalemate in Vietnam and the fact that things weren't improving. Toward the end of the flight, he called me to the rear of the plane. "Dan, I'm having an argument here. He says that things are improving, that we're making progress. And I say things are worse than they were a year ago. You're the one who knows. What do you say the answer is?" I said, "Well, Mr. Secretary, I'm most impressed with how much the same things are than a year ago. And he said, see, that's exactly what I'm saying. We've put another 100,000 troops in there. Things are no better. That means they're really worse. We were on the ground, and McNamara was going out into a foggy day, and I was behind him.
You ask whether I was optimistic or pessimistic. Today I can tell you that military progress in the past 12 months has exceeded our expectations.
He was saying, gentlemen, I'm very encouraged by what I've seen in Vietnam. In every respect, things are better now. We're making progress. Everything is better. And I was thinking, I hope I'm never in a job where I have to lie like that. I learned that McNamara's grave doubts about the war continued to deepen. Behind closed doors, he recommended pulling back on the bombing and pushed for a political settlement. Johnson rejected McNamara's advice.
McNamara had a sense then, very much like people have now, that this was a tragic blunder, that we were in the middle of a catastrophe, and that it was important to try to understand how we had gotten into that catastrophe.
In June of 1967, McNamara ordered a comprehensive study within the Pentagon on the history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
We went to the Rand Corporation and recruited the people there who did historical studies. And then, of course, one of the people we asked was Daniel Ellsberg.
My involvement in the study would change my life and change history in ways I couldn't have imagined.
We classified the Pentagon Papers study as top secret, and every page of every study as top secret, because we considered the existence of the study to be top secret. But the person we were trying to keep it from was not the Vietnamese, who would not have cared at all, or the Russians or the Chinese, but Lyndon Johnson. We feared through the whole study that if the president found out about it, that he would stop it, because Johnson knew that McNamara had doubts about the war and believed that there were a band of civilians in the Pentagon determined to do everything they could to get us out of Vietnam.
I don't want a man in here to go back home thinking otherwise. We are going to win.
But Johnson's optimism was about to shatter. On Vietnam's New Year, 1968, a massive surprise attack caught U.S. troops completely off guard. For the first time, the war reached into Vietnam's cities and towns, including Saigon. The Tet Offensive was a devastating blow to U.S. morale, and the American public began to lose faith in the war.
With a bold series of raids during the last 3 days, the enemy in Vietnam has demolished the myth that Allied military strength controls that country. The communists hit the very heart of Saigon, the capital.
When Johnson's top general asked for more troops, the request was leaked to the New York Times. The story caused a tremendous uproar in Congress.
I would feel that our people were badly misguided and did not understand the consequences of such a disaster.
Well, we agree on one thing, that they can be badly misguided, and you and the president, in my judgment, have been misguiding them for a long time in this war.
I realize now that my previous attitude had been simply mistaken, that I wasn't discharging my responsibilities to the country, to the Constitution, to the public, or to the troops, by keeping those secrets which had led to the escalation of the war, that had been wrong. But the question was, what would make a difference? I met with reporter Neil Sheehan at the New York Times and leaked information about a secret CIA report on enemy troop strength. The story made the front page. It was the first time I had gone outside official channels to affect the conduct of the war. When I was 5, till I was about 15.
And how serious were you at the time?
Well, I spent all my time playing then for 10 years and then didn't play for another 40.
What happened?
My mother died, and she was the one who wanted me to be a concert pianist. On July 4th, 1946, we were traveling to Denver, going through the cornfields of Iowa. Very hot day in the middle of the day. My father fell asleep at the wheel, and the car went off the road into a culvert, a little wall rising by the side of the road, and sheared off the side of the car where my mother and sister were sitting, and killed my mother and sister. I was on the other side behind the driver, so I got a concussion and a broken knee, and I was in a coma for 36 hours, and then in the hospital for about 3.5 months. So I think it did probably leave the impression on me that someone you loved, like my father, a respected and authority, could fall asleep at the wheel and had to be watched, not because they were bad, but because they were inattentive, perhaps, to the risks. "11 months earlier, when I was 14, Hiroshima had been destroyed and Nagasaki. I was very concerned about this turn of human events. I thought it was very ominous. What I saw as a moral, extremely questionable act by our president, whom I admired, Harry Truman. It got confounded in my mind with my father's failure to stay alert and allowing the car to kill my mother and sister.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Never has so much power been used so ineffectively as in Vietnam.
Support for the war was plummeting after Tet, and Johnson withdrew from the 1968 presidential race.
I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
Richard Nixon won the election, promising peace with honor. The public had been led to believe that he had a secret plan to end the war. Henry Kissinger was then talking about the need to get out of Vietnam with a decent interval. Now, that was quite a radical point of view for an establishment person at that time, to say we should be out, and all we ask is that they not embarrass us by taking it over immediately. That led, in me, but in nearly everybody, to the false impression that presumably Nixon agreed with it. Nixon didn't agree with that for a minute. I had given a set of options to Kissinger. I drafted at Rand 6 or 7 alternative approaches in Vietnam to consider at his first National Security Council meeting with Nixon. And he at one point said, "Dan, you don't have a win option." And I said, "Well, I don't think there is a win option." I said, "You could double the number of troops and that would keep things quieter, but until they left. You could use nuclear weapons and kill all the people. I wouldn't call that a win. So there just, as far as I see, is no way to win." I took that opportunity to tell him something that I'd long thought of telling somebody who was about to enter the world of really high secrecy. And I said, "Henry, you're about to get a lot of clearances higher than top secret that you did not know existed. That's going to have a sequence of effects on you. First, a great exhilaration that you're getting all this amazing information that you didn't know even existed. And the next phase is you'll feel like a fool for not having known of any of this. But that won't last long. Very soon, you'll come to think that everyone else is foolish. What would this expert be telling me if he knew what I knew?" So in the end, you stop listening to them.
I think everybody thought that Nixon had been elected to end the war and was going to end the war, and it became very clear to me that he was not.
Mort Halpern was working for Kissinger in the White House. In the late summer of '69, Mort told me He's staying in, and he's threatening escalation.
For once, we've got to use the maximum power of this country against this shit-ass little country to win the war.
In August of 1969, I read the earliest parts of the McNamara study for the first time. Seeing the war from its beginning affected me more than I thought possible. It changed my whole sense of the legitimacy of the war. What I learned was that it was an American war from the start. President Truman financed the French to retake its former colony, even though he knew the French were fighting a national movement that had the support of the people.
The cost of defending freedom, of defending America, must be paid in many forms and in many places.
Eisenhower supported a brutal dictator in canceling elections called for by the 1954 Geneva Accords. So we opposed elections while pretending to support democracy.
We are attempting to help Vietnam maintain its independence and not fall under the domination of the communists.
Kennedy lied to the public and to Congress, saying we would need only advisors, even though his own military experts told him that South Vietnam would be lost without an immediate commitment of American combat units.
We still seek no wider war.
I now saw that Johnson was continuing a pattern of presidential lying. Each president wanted to avoid the stigma of losing Indochina to communism on his watch. It wasn't that we were on the wrong side. We were the wrong side. It was a crime from the start, carried out by 4 presidents as revealed in this study. And now a 5th president was doing the same, with no end in sight. The hundreds of thousands we were killing was unjustified homicide, and I couldn't see the difference between that and murder. Murder had to be stopped.
Henry, you don't have any idea. The only place where you and I disagree at the present time is regarding the bombing. You're so goddamn concerned about the civilians, and I don't give a damn. I don't care. I'm concerned about the civilians because I don't want the world to be mobilized against you as a butcher.
He came from an enormously powerful war bureaucratic machine. And so his thinking came from the entrails of that machine. He had begun to question his own past activities. You know, what did I do? Where was I going? What is the meaning of that picture with the rifle in my hand?
I went to a conference to meet people who were using nonviolent resistance in their lives. A friend of mine told me that he had been a Trotskyist, a labor organizer. And I thought, how does one come to be a Trotskyist? He said, oh, it's like anything else. I met a girl. And it is the way it is. So I met a girl from India who had been a Gandhian. I heard her saying to someone else at some point, I come from a culture in which we have no concept of enemy. And it seemed to me you could no more do without the concept of enemy than without the concept of zero in arithmetic.
I read into his questioning a real wanting to know, and a real wanting to know because he had seen certain things that he didn't like and that he didn't want to have continued in the world. And so that was the kind of link, I think, with what we were all trying to do.
I found myself handing out leaflets in this long vigil line, and at first I simply felt ridiculous. I felt that you could see the words on my forehead practically, what am I doing here? And what is this about? I knew that if any of my colleagues that ran to the Pentagon were somehow to catch word of my doing this, they would think I had gone mad. Those that impressed me on the importance of being willing to pay a cost to yourself were some young men who were going to prison by refusing to cooperate with the draft. One young man, Randy Keeler, was giving a talk.
Within that crowd of people, I was introduced to this fellow from a background that didn't quite fit with the others, and that was Dan.
And he talked very personally about what had led him to leave Stanford and join the War Resisters League office.
If you can imagine a 25-year-old about to go to trial, having been indicted on 5 counts, each one of which had a maximum sentence of 5 years.
And as he was telling this, he said, yesterday our friend Bob went to jail. And his voice broke a little at this. And then he said, a week ago, David Harris, the husband of Joan Baez, went to prison. And he said, and I'm really happy that I'll be joining them. But I'm not worried because I know that the rest of you will be carrying on. So by this time, everybody was standing and just clapping and crying. And I was crying. And I left the auditorium and I found a men's room that was deserted. Sat on the tile floor just sobbing, hysterically crying, for just sobbing for a long time, for over an hour. And I had these various thoughts, but one of the thoughts was the best thing that the best young men of our country can do is go to prison. When I heard you say these words, I'm going to prison, it was as if an axe had split my head. But what had really happened was that my life had split in two. And it was my life after those words that I've lived ever since. And eventually, I got up and washed my face, and then I think I cried some more, and then I thought, okay, now what can I do to help end this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? This trick is called the square circle. Square.
One of the things that stood out about Dan was how severe Dan's judgments were about himself. More than most people I had met, it seemed to me he was still, as a relatively recent convert, he was still sort of transfixed by this question, how could I have done what I did?
Okay.
And slowly, he began filling in the blanks of this thing I had never heard of, the study. Now, I obviously didn't believe in magic potions, but clearly he was referring to something that was so definitive that it was capable of changing your view.
Dan was headed toward walking through the door of being a radical, but he would always he would always go halfway. Back at the Rand Corporation, he sought me out. He said he wanted me to brief him on intelligence in Vietnam, U.S. military intelligence. And so I said, okay, have a seat.
All the Vietnamese have ever wanted is self-determination, really.
He'd been in Vietnam for a couple of years and had a much more radical view of the war than I did at that point. And I talked to him quite a bit at Rand, and I liked him. He's a very likable person, very forthcoming, very funny, very, very smart.
He had sort of given up all his old cohorts at the Rand Corporation and was hanging out with me. He was in my office every day. Then we'd go out to dinner and we'd double date, and people were buzzing about it because he had been one of the top dogs.
He did reports that ultimately got him fired about torture and various other reports that they didn't like. After he left Rand, he talked about lies in the studies he had done, lying that had gone on. I said I knew of a study, had been reading a study that revealed very high-level lying.
I said, Dan, you should leak that to the press.
Keeping silent in public about what I had read and heard made me an accomplice. It was not only they who had kept all these decisions quiet, hidden from the American public. I had kept them quiet. My motives, to be sure, were initially those of an observer, a Rand social scientist interested in understanding the internal processes of government. But my role was one of a participant, even when I acted as an internal critic. Having expressed my objections, I stayed in place, observed, took part. In short, I did the jobs assigned to me. Henry David Thoreau said, "Cast your whole vote, not a strip of paper merely, but your whole influence." What if I were willing to give up my top-secret clearance, my career, my privileged access to decision-makers? What if I gave all that up? What if I were willing to risk prosecution? And I thought, all right, I have in my safe thousands of pages of documents that give the lie to this pattern of deception. I'm not going to be part of this system of lying anymore. So I went and saw Tony, and I said to him, you know, that study I mentioned, I have it, and I'm ready to put it out. I'm going to put it out now. Can you help me?
Can you find a Xerox machine? I said, I've got the very place.
I began Xeroxing the McNamara study in the fall of 1969. At the end of the day, working at Rand, I would put several volumes into my briefcase to take with me. Walking past the security guards, I could feel my heart beating. I couldn't help thinking about the dozen or so secrecy agreements I had signed over the course of my career in government. The task seemed endless. I often worked through the night. Early in the morning, I returned the papers to my safe at Rand and headed home. I'll get back to my house on a little narrow beach in Malibu. I love to body surf, and I would go in every morning before I went to bed. And I remember at some point during this, being in the waves, in the sunlight, and looking back at the hills of Malibu and the waves, which I love, and thinking, how can I be doing this? How can I be giving all this up?
I was 13 at the time. He said there was a secret history of the Vietnam War that he'd been reading, and he had a copy of this. And he had decided that he wanted to make a copy of it and make it available to Congress. He described it in terms of civil disobedience. Would I help him? I didn't suppose that he literally needed my help, but that this was something risky and very important to him, and it was important to him that I be a part of it in some way. And I think that very afternoon began copying the Pentagon Papers.
The children were in between on this one in a way that I didn't realize. Their mother, my former wife, really thought that I'd done something very bad and had involved her children in it. Whereas my thought was that I'd given them a chance to be in on something quite historic. Well, I didn't know when I'd be stopped, and I thought it would be within a matter of weeks, and that I might never see my children again, except through thick glass. I wanted my son, who was 13, to see that I was doing this because I thought it was the right thing to do and doing it in a straightforward manner, that I hadn't gone crazy. There was a night where Mary, my daughter, who was only 10, got into it. She complained about being left in the car, so she came up. So I gave her a job to do. Tony was copying, and Robert was collating, and Mary was cutting top secret off the top and bottom of the pages.
Just working away when all of a sudden there was a knock on the door.
There was a knock on the door, the glass door next to me, and I see two large blue uniformed policemen.
And there was an LAPD standing there. And I said to myself, these guys are really good.
So they saw this family scene, you know, of my 10-year-old daughter and 13-year-old son. I sort of casually covered the machine. I took the lid and I put it over the top secret stuff on this and cleared up a little and then opened the door.
They said, no, your alarm's gone off again. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, I gotta learn how to figure out how to do that. And they said, okay, you know, be more careful.
I thought, there was the guy looking through the window at me, at the crime of the century, crime in quotes, of course, and didn't realize it, went right on, never realized it, never heard from him again.
The study was 47 volumes, 7,000 pages. It would take me months of Xeroxing. I put my hopes in Congress. I took the papers to the most outspoken critics of the war. Surely they would embrace these revelations and would want to make them public.
The people that I needed to talk to or somehow to reach were the ones who had been saying they had been against the war for years while I was supporting the war, longer than me, who said that they saw through the war, that they saw that it was wrong, and what I wanted them to do now, and what I still want them to do, and what they still can do, is to act.
But no one did. Meanwhile, the war was escalating. Then I heard Congressman Pete McCloskey give a speech.
I said, I think they're not telling us the truth about Vietnam, and I showed some of the things I'd just seen a month earlier.
He had come back and revealed information about the secret bombing of Laos. Here was a U.S. representative using the word lies. So I thought, all right, here's a man with the guts then to use some documentation.
And somebody handed me a note. The note said, you're right, I have information that will document what you're saying.
And he said he'd like to discuss it with me, but he was shortly leaving. And if I was willing to come with him, we could talk about it on the way. So to show how desperate I was at this point, I was paying for a trip to California just to talk with this representative.
And he had a passion about him, an intensity, I guess is the best way I'd describe him. He didn't smile much. He was deadly serious, wanting me to understand these documents.
I thought then, and I think more now than before, that documents had a power to be taken seriously and to attract attention that nothing else did.
I think all of us, knowing that they were top secret, were not sure what our rights were with respect to top secret documents. But those papers were a revelation. And I testified in front of the Fulbright Committee. Afterwards, I went up to him and I said, Senator, I've got a set of papers here that if they were known to the public, would cause public opinion to turn against the war. Well, he said, yeah, I got a set too.
There obviously was a kind of culture of timidity in Congress, deference to the executive branch, and a fear of being called unpatriotic, a fear of being accused of revealing military secrets and so on. And this culture was so strong that even senators and congressmen who were against the war didn't want to do anything with the papers that Dan Ellsberg offered them.
I had told my former wife what I was doing. She had told her stepmother, who had then told the FBI, it turned out. And the FBI then came to Harry Rowan. As president of RAND, he had been involved in getting me access to the Pentagon Papers. His impression at the time was that I had not broken any law if I had given it to the Senate, that they had a right to see it. But I expected the FBI to come down on me very shortly after that.
He had really radically changed in his view of the war, and I knew that. I knew he had changed. In the first year of marriage, we're talking about him going to prison for the rest of his life. He gave me a number of the papers to read, and as I was reading it, I was horrified by the coldness, the calculatedness, and in particular, the language of the torturers. They were quotes saying, "We'll give the North Vietnamese one more turn of the screw," or "let's try the water drop technique." And I was thinking, what is this? How can the leaders of our country be talking in this language and then misleading the American public? And then I just started to cry because I knew that he really had to give them out. And so there were tears in my eyes, and I came out and I just said, do it.
I walked into this hotel room when he and I holed up, and Neil says, "Rick, look at what we've got." And I mean, it was just staggering. The raw, top secret, eyes-only documents. From Earl Wheeler to General Westmoreland, from Johnson to Taylor. You could go back and see, yes, Kennedy did send in troops in violation of the Geneva Accord. Yes, Johnson did start the buildup before he said he was going to. I remember writing this story. These guys were lying through their teeth when they were talking to us. And here it is in black and white. There's no way of denying it.
The editors immediately understood that this thing was so sensitive and was going to have to be kept under wraps. And so they decided to move the whole thing out of the New York Times offices and to go and rent a suite at the Hilton.
There were a lot of difficult, important decisions to be made, and we needed to know the material in order to make those decisions, and that took time. And Ellsberg couldn't understand that. Ellsberg was constantly pressing. He always wanted to know, when was the Times going to run this? Was the Times really going to run this? Was it really going to be big? When was it going to happen?
As a source, I sort of thought of myself as being on the team somehow, you know, and that we were at a joint First Amendment informing the public kind of mission and, you know, working together. They clearly didn't think of me in that way.
Once somebody gave us material, it was our job to determine what to do with it, how to play it, what to use, whether or not to use it.
May 71, there was a planned demonstration in Washington for people to commit acts of civil disobedience, to block streets and to block bridges, to do everything possible to disrupt life in Washington in order to demonstrate the anger against the war. In other words, the intensity of feeling about the war had grown. So a number of us gathered in my apartment, Noam Chomsky and Dan Ellsberg and I, and we went to Washington and we formed ourselves as an affinity group. And Dan Ellsberg was, you might say, our squad leader. He took command, and he was telling us when to get up and when to sit down and when to move and where to move, and he was very decisive, and we followed his orders. Not exactly a democratic situation. We would sit down in the middle of a street, tear gas would be lobbed in our direction, and we would run. The National Guard was out, and the 101st Airborne had descended on Washington. The level of anti-war activity had been raised.
Should we do it? Shouldn't we do it? And Neil and I, after we got a feel for what was in there, argued that we could go ahead, that this would not jeopardize national security, and indeed it was a public service.
All I knew was they had a bunch of classified papers. And the question for me as a lawyer is, can you publish classified papers? The law here is the statute called the Espionage Act. I mean, if you read it and stretched it and pushed it, it was possible to apply it to the publication of the Pentagon Papers.
We're sitting there down in the engine room doing the work. We're not up at the corporate hierarchy, but we're hearing the battles going on up there, and we hear that, of course, the news comes to us because we're at risk too. The law firm the Times had used for decades said, don't publish, and by the way, you're all violating the Espionage Act and you're going to go to jail. Believe me, we heard that. And happily, Jim Goodale, as the Times in-house attorney, took a different position.
The risk that the New York Times took was a life and death risk of an institution. And I don't mean the 5,000 people who work for the Times. I mean the leader of the institutional press in a free country.
Lurking in the backs of our minds was the fact that we would never survive just suppressing this material, that sooner or later it would be known that we had it and that we had flinched and that we had not published it and that would have been such a disgrace.
And we heard the publisher wavered back and forth, and then finally, about 10 days, while we're gearing up this, what were we publishing? Gone with the Wind 3 times over in 10 days? I mean, this was a huge project. We finally hear the publisher had signed off and was going to agree to do it. And I remember that Jimmy Greenfield told us he was taking the publisher golfing on Saturday, which was the day the presses ran, to make sure the publisher didn't change his mind.
I guess it was a Saturday night. The four of us, Dan and Pat Ellsberg and my wife, decided we'd go to the movies, see a movie that Dan Ellsberg, I think, had seen 7 times and wanted to see again, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I could see that Dan was agitated in some way, and I asked him what was going on, and he said he had called a friend on the New York Times, and this friend of his said, well, I can't talk to you now. The Times building is encircled by armed guards, and the printing presses are rolling, and we are printing tomorrow a top-secret government document.
This weekend, portions of a highly classified Pentagon document came to light for all the world to see and brought cries of outrage from Washington.
The Pentagon Papers make it abundantly clear how little the public knew of what was going on behind the scenes during...
Its main effect is to refute the notion that we stumbled into the war.
At the White House, a spokesman said President Nixon got his first look at the secret report when a copy was delivered to him today.
This goddamn New York Times expose of the most highly classified documents of the war.
You mean that was leaked out of the Pentagon?
Sir, this is a devastating security breach of the greatest magnitude of anything I've ever seen.
Did we know this was coming out?
No, we did not, sir.
I'd just start right at the top and fire some people. I mean, whatever department it came out of, I'd fire the top guy.
The first issue they ran had a paragraph from Assistant Secretary of Defense to Secretary McNamara. I can almost tell it by memory. We're in Vietnam, 10% to help the South Vietnamese, 20% to hold back the Chinese, and 70% to save American face. Well, every woman in America that had a boyfriend or a husband, they could take it if we were defending the South Vietnamese, but to learn we're just trying to save face, that is a thing that angers you.
Monday was a very interesting day. I came back to the New York Times, hustled on the elevator, went up to the top executive floor. There was the biggest shouting argument ever heard in my life. A telegram that had come from John Mitchell, Nixon's Attorney General. The telegram said, we want you to stop publication immediately, and if you don't, we're going to take appropriate action. I mean, what in God's name have we been fighting for in this country for 200 or 300 years, to have the right to speak and the right to publish, the right to think against a threat by the government, if all we're going to do is give it all up because someone sends you a telegram?
Now, don't care how they feel about the war, whether they're for it or against it. You can or should not do it. It's an attack on the integrity of government. And by God, I'm going to fight that son of a bitchy paper. They don't know what's going to hit them now.
A federal court has ordered the New York Times to stop publication temporarily. The government asked for and got an injunction against the Times.
Before the Nixon administration enjoined the New York Times, there had never been another injunction brought against a media company in a federal court.
A name has now come out as the possible source of the Times Pentagon documents. It is that of Daniel Ellsberg, 40 years old, one-time Marine, later a top policy analyst for the Defense and State Departments during the Vietnam buildup.
There was no sign of Professor Ellsberg or his family at their home in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
And we're looking on the television, the morning news, and we notice that the FBI is at our little apartment in Cambridge. And we say we can't go back. We go to a motel for a couple of nights under false names. We don't have any clothes, we don't have a toothbrush, we don't have anything.
He knew they'd be looking for him. He knew they'd be looking to arrest him. And he wanted to have an opportunity to give the papers to more newspapers.
I came out of a 3 o'clock meeting the day after the Times had been enjoined, and my deputy said, maybe you better look at this. I dialed a number, and a voice said, if I can get you what you want, will you print them? I said, damn well we'll print them.
The Post picked up the Pentagon story where the Times left off, but was ordered to halt its publication of the material in a court ruling last night.
There was no way of knowing when the New York Times and Washington Post could resume publication of the papers, if at all. This could be the end unless other newspapers were willing to defy the government. I had heard that Senator Mike Gravel would do a daily filibuster until the draft expired.
Well, I'm just chugging along with my filibuster, and I get a phone call, and I don't know who it is. He says immediately, is this Senator Gravel? I said, yes, it is. He says, would you read the Pentagon Papers as part of your filibuster? I said, yes. Now, please hang up.
As I put it to him over the phone, if you're really going to do a filibuster, I can give you material that'll keep you busy reading until Christmas.
The person who physically gave me the papers was Ben Begdickian. He was the editor at the Washington Post.
He's a junior senator, and he's from Alaska, and that doesn't carry much weight. So he was, I think, chair of the Building and Grounds Committee.
So we meet, and I want to be a little secretive, so we're meeting outside the Senate chambers in the columns next to the Capitol. Lo and behold, Bob Dole comes out. And Dole sees me, and he has something to say to me, so he comes over. So Ben slips behind the column, and I try to dismiss Dole real quick. And then I go back to Ben. He's going to get the papers to me in some faraway, dark corner of maybe Rock Creek Park. I always said, Ben, that's not the way we're going to do it. At midnight, under the marquee of the Mayflower Hotel, you will park your car there. I will come up next with my car. I'll get out, you open the trunk of your car, and I'll open the trunk of my car.
I drive down in my Carmen Kia, and he's got a couple of aides there, and I said, this is heavy, you may want your aides to carry it. He said, no, I have immunity and they don't.
And we transfer the papers to me, just like that, in seconds, and I speed away.
While I was still underground, I was contacted by the most trusted man in America.
Good evening. Daniel Ellsberg, a former State Department and Pentagon planner, and of late something of a phantom figure, agreed today to be interviewed at a secret location. I asked him what he considers the most important revelations to date from the Pentagon documents.
I think the lesson is that the people of this country can't afford to let the president run the country by himself without the help of the Congress, without the help of the public.
Dan does this interview, which comes out on CBS, nationwide television, as the biggest FBI manhunt since the Lindbergh kidnapping is going on looking for us. But we still hadn't given out enough of the papers.
Today, another lid broke loose.
The Boston Globe began its series based on presumably classified government documents.
The Chicago Sun-Times entered the drama today by running a story which says that the Kennedy administration...
Today, the 11 night newspapers and the Los Angeles Times joined the procession.
The ball game was over. Any effort at suppressing the Pentagon Papers was going to fail. Dan and his network had distributed portions of the Pentagon Papers to 17 different organizations.
They couldn't stop them. As one of the lawyers said, it was like herding bees.
The press said, we can look at this, we can make a valid judgment about what serves national security, and we can be and will be independent from our government. And that was a declaration of independence, and it really changed the relationship between the government and the media ever since.
The Pentagon Papers story was on the nightly news, the first 7 or 8 minutes of the nightly news every night for 2 weeks.
So that gave it as much public attention as I could possibly ask for.
We were underground, so we were able to watch the news day and night. And this thing was unfolding in the most dramatic way.
Alaska's 41-year-old Democratic Senator Mike Gravel held a mock meeting of his subcommittee on buildings and grounds with only himself present and began reading aloud the 7,000-page Pentagon secret report in public.
The papers prove that for 20 years, we have been victims of our Southeast Asia policy.
I was frightened to death over releasing the Pentagon Papers. I had no idea whether I was going to prison. All I could think of was, my country is killing people, we're maiming Americans, and this is terrible. And so I was overcome with emotion, not patriotism, just emotion of something you love dearly that has gone astray.
He continued until exhaustion and emotion overcame him after 1 o'clock this morning.
I collected myself and I asked, now keep in mind, I'm the only one on the committee. I asked unanimous consent to put all of these papers into the record, and I've got the gavel and I slam it and I say, hearing no objection, so ordered, that's it, papers are out. They're in the Senate record.
Can you stop? Slow down.
Even if the FBI had wanted to arrest him outside the courthouse this morning, they probably couldn't have done it. Ellsberg was walled off by newsmen and supporters as he admitted that he was indeed the man who brought the Pentagon Papers to the press and congressional leaders.
I did this clearly at my own jeopardy, and I am prepared to answer to all the consequences of these decisions.
Dr. Ellsberg, you have any concern about the possibility of going to prison for this?
We have a quick back. Wouldn't you go to prison to self-fund this war?
In one of the most important judicial decisions in the history of the country, the Supreme Court today ruled that the New York Times and the Washington Post may continue to publish the secret Pentagon Papers.
The ruling was amazingly simple. It was that proving the need for prior censorship is a heavy burden, and the government didn't meet that burden.
The decision was a great one. The story today is what the Constitution of this country means to us. I've never appreciated what the meaning and importance of separation of powers is so much as in the last week.
Were you surprised at how the...
When Dan Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, he was doing it to stop the war. Perhaps the most important legacy he left us with, though, was a Supreme Court case, the Pentagon Papers case, which is perhaps the most important First Amendment decision in the court's history. I can guarantee you that every day there's a First Amendment lawyer out there citing the Pentagon Papers case in order to protect free speech and free press against government encroachment.
When we finally won the right to continue publication from the Supreme Court, this was a firm ruling that national security alone, the cry of national security, does not justify censorship in advance.
I wanted to tell you that I was so damn mad when that Supreme Court had to come down. First, I didn't like their decision, but unbelievable, wasn't it?
It was unbelievable.
You know, those clowns we got on there, I'll tell you, I hope I outlive the bastards.
Persons close to the president vehemently deny that he is in any vengeful mood toward the New York Times or any other newspaper. As for fears expressed by reporters and editors that there is big trouble ahead from the administration, the Nixon men say that is pure paranoia, ridiculous.
Mr. Ellsberg, or Dr. Ellsberg himself, has been hailed as a hero by a lot of people, condemned as a traitor by others. We welcome, please, the man who made the whole thing possible, Dr. Daniel Ellsberg.
I think that the drama that surrounded the release of the papers, which centered on the personality and experience of Dan Ellsberg himself, gave the papers a prominence that they probably wouldn't have had a grayer personality been associated with this release.
That much applause without even doing a monologue? That's amazing. Is there any way to answer in 30 seconds what people can do?
I think one thing that people will conclude when they read it is that they have not asked enough. They have not expected enough or demanded enough in the way of boldness, in the way of responsibility from their public servants. Make that known, and I think that our Constitution will continue to function better than it has been in the past.
I think he did betray a trust, and he put in jeopardy not only his welfare, but that of everybody else who was involved.
There was no question in my mind that my best friend, really, Harry Rowan, would be definitely associated with what I'd done. And the fact that I did it while he was president, that this happened, this security breach happened. So I knew that would hurt him, might lose him his job, as it did, actually. E.M. Forster said, if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying a friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country. And I remember when that was quoted to me, my reaction right away was, I don't agree with that at all. We're talking about many, many, many lives here. We're talking about shortening a war.
Not long after the release of the Pentagon Papers, I was at a conference at UCLA. There were at least a dozen people from Iran at that conference, and not one of them would shake hands with Dan. Not one would sit near him. They treated him as a traitor. And whether they meant a traitor to his country or a traitor to his organization, it's hard to know.
I was Typhoid Mary. I was a leper with a bell around my neck. I've come to realize the fear of being cut out from the group of people you respect and whose respect you want and normally expect. That keeps people participating in anything, no matter how terrible.
Whatever his intentions may have been, in your opinion, did Daniel Ellsberg betray his country?
I would put it another way. Daniel Ellsberg, whatever his intentions, gave aid and comfort to the enemy. And under those circumstances, that is inexcusable. After all, he is putting himself above the President of the United States, above the Congress, above our whole system of government, when he says, in effect, that he would determine what should be made public.
I think that there is probably some good justification for the strong feelings Nixon had. He would make a decision in the National Security Council and the next day read it on the front page of the New York Times or some other newspaper. This makes it virtually impossible to govern.
Just because some guy's going to be a martyr, we can't be in a position of allowing a fellow to get away with this kind of wholesale thievery, or otherwise it's going to happen all over the government. I just say that we've got to keep our eye on the main ball. The main ball's Ellsberg. We got to get this son of a bitch.
The leak of the Pentagon Papers changed the Nixon White House. It really is what some of us have called the beginning of the dark period. I mean, it was rough and tumble before, but it got down and dirty. So it's really a defining event for the Nixon presidency. And this is when Bud Krogh, was selected to head up the so-called plumbers unit.
I was summoned to the Oval Office by the president. John Ehrlichman and I met with him. There was some suspicion that Dr. Ellsberg had access to the more recent war plans that had been developed by the Nixon administration and would be able to release those documents. I came from that meeting feeling very strongly that I was dealing with a national security crisis, and I was to take any means necessary to respond to it.
The difficulty is that all the good lawyers always say, well, we've got to win the court case, screw the court case, but to convict the son of a bitch in the press. That's the way it's done.
The president had decided to set up a special investigations unit in the White House staff.
We've got to get a better team. There's one guy on the outside. He's hard as nails. His name is Howard Hunt. Or he can do it, and I'll direct it myself. And I play it gloves off. Now, goddamn it, get it going on.
Did Daniel Ellsberg work alone? Was he working with some other people? Was it part of a conspiracy? And it was in that context that a proposal was made by E. Howard Hunt to get information that could be used to discredit Dr. Ellsberg. A covert operation ought to be undertaken to examine all of the files still held by Dr. Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis Fielding. This went to John Ehrlichman. Underneath that proposal were two lines, approve of the line, disapprove of the line. He wrote his large E after approve, and then put in, under your assurance, it is not traceable.
The FBI came one day and said, I'm afraid we have a subpoena here for you to testify today at the grand jury. My father was very upset. He somehow thought that there was something more that my mother could do to prevent this somehow, if she had better legal advice or whatever her attitude was. So you're the one who got him into this. Of course, he's gonna just tell the truth. And my father said, well, of course, you've got to just tell the truth. My personal involvement in the whole thing, the people I knew about, and the copying of the Pentagon Papers, that became the focus of the indictment.
I have a prepared statement that I'd like to read.
Well, I said to myself that I would not testify against him.
You put my cigarette out.
Because after all, to begin with, I had urged him to do it.
The Attorney General offers me the alternative of collaborating with him in his attempt to prosecute Daniel Ellsberg by testifying in secret before a grand jury. For me, that is no choice.
He was immediately put in custody for contempt of court. He offended the prosecutorial team by refusing to cooperate in any way in the grand jury. If Tony had testified, he would have been out scot-free.
The first thing that came to my mind was Gandhi's dictum, you should not cooperate with evil.
The Pentagon Papers drama changed abruptly into the Pentagon Papers media freakout and cameraman's farce as the documents arrived at the Senate.
I think Dan was disappointed in that he may have expected too much from the publication of the papers. He may have expected that the publication of the papers would create a greater sensation than it did. Of course, it created a sensation.
Where is Mr. Ellsberg? I hope he's in the jail.
But I think he was disappointed in the fact that the substance of the papers, the content of the papers, did not seem to be absorbed by the public.
I gave up my job, my career, my clearance, and I staked my freedom on a gamble. If the American people knew the truth about how they had been lied to, about the myths that had led them to endorse this butchery for 25 years, that they would choose against it. And the risk that you take when you do that is that you'll learn something ultimately about your fellow citizens that you won't like to hear. And that is that they hear it, they learn from it, they understand it,
and they proceed to ignore it.
I still think we ought to take the dice off now. I think we let drown people get drowned out about 200,000. Well, no, I'd rather use a nuclear bomb. That's right. That, I think, would just create too much. A nuclear bomb? No problem. I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake.
I remember speaking about a year ago and expressing the hope that we would end this war before we had dropped another 1 million tons of bombs on the Vietnamese. Well, that hope has been disappointed.
We could never get into the paper the very fact that we had reported the bombing tonnage. They didn't even go so far as to say, the Ellsbergs have this funny habit in every daily press conference of saying, here's how many bombs we dropped last week.
We've dropped another 200,000 tons of bombs on Indochina. That's 10 Hiroshimas, 1 Hiroshima a week.
They never even mentioned we'd said it, let alone reflect on the fact that it was happening. When I knew we were going to bomb Vietnam forever, that was like bombing the neighborhood. The people there were more than pictures for me, and they were more than numbers.
When we went to select our jury, we brought in an expert, actually a psychiatrist. He told us we were defending 2 young men, bright, high achievers, men with a future, who were willing to risk it all for the sake of not themselves or their own careerist interests, but for the sake of a principle. And the psychiatrist said to us, you don't want on this jury men of middle age, because these are people who in the course of their lives might possibly have sacrificed principle for the sake of career, for the sake of family, and they lived with that compromise, and they will have a lot of disdain, even contempt, for 2 men who did it for the sake of principle and took the risk.
In Los Angeles today, Daniel Ellsberg returned to the witness stand in the Pentagon Papers case, and for the first time, the chief defendant spelled out how he changed from hawk to dove on the Vietnam War.
When I was on the stand for 4.5 days, I actually recalled this particular incident in 1966 when I came on a burning village. That it was burning because our Vietnamese troops had fired on it, and in the course of that, I saw some kids picking through the embers of their huts for a little plastic doll. That was extremely anguishing for me to see this sad appearance. This is what the war meant to them, really, the destruction of their homes and their lives.
At the Pentagon Papers trial in California today, it was revealed that the people who burglarized the Watergate also burglarized the office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist.
Mr. Ehrlichman, are you telling me that the break-in to Dr. Fielding's office was to satisfy the President of the United States?
The President wanted very much to make sure that a thing like this could not happen again.
At no time did anyone ask, is this the right thing to do? We never looked at either the legal issues, the ethical issues, the spiritual issues. None of those things came to the level of consciousness. It was a collapse of integrity of the first order.
The revelation in the trial of the Pentagon Papers that the White House had sent the plumbers to Los Angeles really, I think, broke open the Watergate scandal. And then to top it all off, if this story needed topping, the fact that the President met with the presiding judge.
The man presiding over the Ellsberg case, Judge Matthew Byrne, today confirmed that Ehrlichman had offered him the job of FBI director.
It didn't seem possible, but there were even more sensational developments today involving the White House. an admission from the Federal Bureau of Investigation that it had listened to Daniel Ellsberg on wiretaps as long as 2 years before he released the Pentagon Papers.
Good evening. A federal judge in Los Angeles today declared a mistrial in the Pentagon Papers case. He dismissed all the charges against Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo. The judge ruled that the government had so tainted its own case as to make a fair trial impossible.
A presidential prosecution that started, we now know, in order to help re-elect a president, and it's ending now, I think, to avoid impeaching that same president. But it won't stop that process because the facts, thanks in part to this trial, are out on the table. They're out of the safes, just as the Pentagon Papers are out of the safes, and they're the same kind of facts. And they can't be put back in the safes.
Son of a bitch thief is made a national hero and sending it off on a mistrial. The New York Times gets a Pulitzer Prize for stealing documents. We're trying to get at thieves. What in the name of God have you come to?
Because of what Dan did, and the overreaction of an imperial president, if you will, to what had happened, it changed history. It was the cover-up of the Ellsberg break-in that concerned the White House. And the seeds of all of Watergate occur in the Pentagon Papers.
The greatest result of what he did was to get President Nixon out of office. That wasn't, I'm sure, any part of his expectation or his intention.
What has remained significant about the release of the Pentagon Papers is the decision by a public official to give priority to conscience as compared to career.
The fact is that secrets can be held by men in the government whose careers have been spent learning how to keep their mouths shut. I was one of those.
If you have somebody who starts with such a background within government and who understands what Dan understands about how it works from the inside, and who then continues to speak out, constantly trying to unmask the lies and reveal the truth so that people can make honest, clear decisions about their own lives and about the life of our nation, the life of the world. He is the preeminent whistleblower in the very best and broadest and deepest sense.
We as a people do have that power, the power to change ourselves and history. We are here today.
I think the resonance that I feel with Dan is that he is trying always to do what he thinks is the highest right under the circumstances, regardless of the consequences. I was not able to do that for when I worked in the government. I was too tied into the group I was working for. But Dan does that all the time. It's an amazing life, the way he has lived it over the last 30 years since all of those things occurred.
His act had an effect on him, a profound effect on him and on the rest of his life. He was never going to rest easy from that point on unless he was part of some movement against war and for social justice. So all these years since then, he has acted in the same spirit in which he revealed the papers to the nation.
The courage we need is not the courage, the fortitude to be obedient in the service of an unjust war, to help conceal lies, to do our job by a boss who has usurped power and is acting as an outlaw government. It is the courage at last to face
honestly the truth and the reality of what we are doing in the world and act responsibly to change it.